real ghost towns left behind by the gold rush, and how the last residents lived in 19. A man named James Stewart Kane sat alone in an empty town. Around him stood over 170 abandoned buildings, saloons where men once gambled their fortunes, churches where families once prayed, a schoolhouse where children once laughed, all silent now, all empty. He was the last caretaker of Bodie, California town that had once held 10,000 souls. Now it held only him. Every morning, he walked the same dusty streets. Every night, he locked doors that no one would ever open. He was guarding a ghost. Why do some people refuse to leave, even when everything around them has died? What secrets do these abandoned places still hold? And what really happened to the thousands who vanished when the gold ran out? Today, we walk through the ruins of dreams. Welcome to the ghost towns of the gold rush. And don't abandon us. Leave a like, turn on notifications, subscribe to the channel, and maybe you'll find a gold coin. The middle of the 19th century witnessed one of the largest mass migrations in human history. In 1848, a carpenter named James Marshall discovered gold at Sutter's Mill in California. Within months, word had spread across the globe. By 1849, 300,000 people had abandoned their homes, their families, and their former lives to chase a dream of instant wealth in the American West. They came from everywhere. Farmers from the Midwest, immigrants from China, Ireland, and Germany, merchants from the dreamers fleeing poverty. They poured into the mountains and deserts, establishing towns wherever gold was found. These settlements erupted from nothing, wooden structures thrown up in weeks, populations exploding from 0 to thousands in a matter of months. But gold, by its very nature, runs out. And when the precious metal disappeared, so did the people who had come to find it. What remained were the towns themselves, frozen in time, abandoned to the elements, slowly crumbling into dust. Today, hundreds of these ghost towns still stand across the American West. Monuments to ambition, greed, and the terrible speed with which fortune can reverse itself. This is a story of those who stayed behind, the last residents of places the world forgot. The guardians of silence. Bodie, the wickedest town in the West, high in the mountains of eastern California, at an elevation of over 8,000 feet, stands the most perfectly preserved ghost town in America. Bodie was never supposed to exist. When prospector William Bodie discovered gold here in 1859, the location seemed impossible for human habitation. Winters brought temperatures of 40 degrees below zero. Snow buried buildings up to their rooftops. The nearest supply town was 75 miles away over treacherous mountain passes. None of this stopped the miners. By 1880, Bodie had exploded into a city of nearly 10,000 people. 65 saloons lined the main street. A red light district flourished on the north end of town. Violence was so common that the phrase, "bad man from Bodie," became synonymous with danger across the West. Newspapers recorded that the town averaged at least one murder per day during its peak years. A young girl, upon learning her family was moving to Bodie, reportedly wrote in her diary, "Goodbye God, I'm going to Bodie." But the gold that had created Bodie also destroyed it. By 1882, the richest veins had been exhausted. Miners began leaving as quickly as they had arrived. By 1920, fewer than 100 people remained. By 1940, that number had dwindled to a handful of caretakers who refused to abandon the town they had known their entire lives. The last permanent residents of Bodie lived in a strange twilight existence. They occupied houses surrounded by abandonment, walking past empty storefronts every day, maintaining buildings that no one would ever use again. They had become ghosts themselves, living among the dead, preserving memories that no one else cared to remember. What compels a person to remain in a place everyone else has abandoned? The answer, found in the stories of ghost town caretakers across the West, reveals something profound about human attachment to place and memory. The Kane family of Bodie represents perhaps the most remarkable example. James Stewart Kane arrived in Bodie as a young man during its final years of prosperity. He accumulated property as others fled, eventually becoming the largest landowner in a town with no inhabitants. When he died in 1969, his family continued his work, not for profit, but from a sense of obligation that defied economic logic. These caretakers lived without the amenities that most Americans took for granted. No electricity illuminated their nights until generators were installed decades later. No running water flowed from their taps. No telephone connected them to the outside world. They heated their homes with wood stoves, read by candlelight, and made the 75-mile journey to civilization only when absolutely necessary. Their daily routines revolved around preservation. They replaced rotting boards on buildings that would never again house businesses. They swept dust from floors that no customers would ever cross. They wound clocks in abandoned homes, as if the former residents might return at any moment to check the time. This was not mere maintenance, it was a ritual of remembrance, a refusal to let the past simply disappear. The psychological toll of such isolation rarely appeared in official records, but traces can be found. Letters from caretakers speak of conversations with absent friends, of hearing voices in empty saloons, of dreams where the town was full again and the streets echoed with life. They were not insane, merely human, coping with loneliness through imagination. Not all ghost towns were built on gold. Calico, in California's Mojave Desert, rose and fell on the promise of silver. Discovered in '80, the silver deposits here produced over $86 million in, or over just 12 years. A staggering fortune that attracted thousands of miners to one of the most inhospitable landscapes in North America. And you know what would bring me a fortune and satisfaction? Your like. So, subscribe to the channel and leave your like. Summer temperatures in Calico regularly exceeded 115 degrees. Water had to be hauled from miles away and sold at prices that would bankrupt a modern consumer. The desert wind carried sand that infiltrated everything: food, clothing, lungs. Miners developed a persistent cough that locals simply called the Calico hack. Yet people came anyway. At its peak, Calico boasted over 500 mines, a population of 1,200, and all the infrastructure of a proper town: schools, churches, a newspaper called the Calico Print. The main street stretched for nearly a mile, lined with businesses that operated 24 hours a day to serve miners working different shifts. Then, in 1896, silver prices collapsed. The metal that built Calico became nearly worthless overnight. Within months, the exodus began. Families packed what they could carry and walked away from homes they had built with their own hands. By 1900, Calico was effectively dead. But Calico's story did not end there. Unlike Bodie, which was preserved in its state of decay, Calico was resurrected, first by private owners, who turned it into a tourist attraction, then by the county of San Bernardino, which maintains it today. The ghost town became a living museum, populated not by miners but by actors in period costume, serving not silver but souvenirs. This raises a question that haunts all preserved ghost towns. When we restore the dead, are we honoring their memory or erasing it? If Bodie represents preservation and Calico represents resurrection, then Rhyolite represents something else entirely: complete abandonment. This Nevada ghost town, located on the edge of Death Valley, offers perhaps the starkest example of how quickly civilization can collapse when its economic foundation disappears. Rhyolite was born in 1904 when prospectors discovered gold in the surrounding hills. Within 3 years, the town had grown to over 10,000 inhabitants. It boasted amenities that would have been impressive in any city of the era: electrolytes powered by its own generating plant, a stock exchange, an opera house that hosted traveling performers, and a train depot that connected this desert outpost to the rest of America. The town's confidence was visible in its architecture. Where most mining towns made do with wooden structures, Rhyolites, residents built in stone and concrete. A 3-story bank dominated the main street. A train station featured ornate, decorative elements. The famous bottle house, constructed from 50,000 beer and liquor bottles, demonstrated both the creativity and the drinking habits of the local population. Then came the financial panic of 19. Banks across America failed. Investment in mining operations evaporated. Rhyolite's mines, which had never been as rich as initial estimates suggested, could not survive the economic downturn. By 1910, the population had dropped to fewer than 700. By 1920, it was essentially zero. What makes Rhyolite unique is what the last residents left behind. Unlike other ghost towns, where departing families took everything portable, Rhyolite was abandoned so quickly that personal possessions remained in place. Dishes sat on tables, clothes hung in closets. Newspapers lay open to articles about events that would never matter again. It was as if the entire population had simply evaporated, leaving their material lives frozen in place. The final years of a dying town follow a pattern so consistent it seems almost scripted. Understanding this pattern helps explain both why towns died and why some residents refused to leave until the very end. First comes denial. Even as mine production declines and families begin departing, the remaining residents insist that prosperity will return. New veins will be discovered. Prices will recover. The exodus is temporary. This phase can last years, sustained by occasional small strikes that briefly revive hope. Then comes adaptation. As businesses close and services disappear, those who remain must become increasingly The general store closes, so residents must travel to distant towns for supplies. The doctor leaves, so minor injuries must be treated with home remedies, and major injuries become death sentences. The school closes, so children must be educated at home or sent away to relatives. Finally comes acceptance. The handful of residents who remain stop waiting for the town to revive. They no longer speak of when things get better. They speak only of maintenance, of preservation, of holding on for as long as they can. They become custodians of memory, their purpose no longer economic but existential. The daily life of these final residents was defined by routine. They rose with the sun, because candles and lamp oil were expensive. They tended gardens that provided fresh vegetables, hunted game that supplemented their protein, collected rainwater because wells had been abandoned. They performed maintenance on buildings, not because anyone required it, but because the alternative, watching their town crumble, was psychologically unbearable. Perhaps the most poignant figures in ghost town history are the children who grew up in dying communities. Too young to have known the towns in their prosperity, they experienced only the long decline playing in empty buildings, attending schools with dwindling classmates, watching their friends' families depart one by one. In Bodie, school enrollment records tell a story of accelerating abandonment. In 1880, over 600 children attended the town's schools. By 1900, that number had fallen to fewer than 50. By 1910, fewer than a dozen students remained. The final classes were held in buildings designed for hundreds, where a handful of children sat in vast empty rooms, their voices echoing off walls that had once absorbed the noise of crowds. These children developed a unique relationship with their environment. They knew every abandoned building, every hidden cellar, every secret space. The ghost town was their playground, a vast expanse of structures that adults had forgotten but children could explore endlessly. They invented games among the ruins, told stories about the people who had lived in houses now empty, created imaginary companions to populate streets that held no other children. When these children eventually left, and almost all of them did, seeking opportunities that dying towns could not provide, they carried memories that shaped their entire lives. Some returned decades later to find their childhood homes collapsed, their schools demolished, their playgrounds erased. Others never returned at all, preferring to preserve the ghost town as they remembered it, rather than confront what time had done. Why they stayed. The decision to remain in a dying town was rarely simple. Those who stayed to the end did so for reasons as varied as human nature itself, and understanding these motivations reveals much about our attachment to place. For some, the reason was purely practical. They owned property that could not be sold. Who would buy a house in a town with no economy? They had invested their life savings in businesses that had become worthless. Leaving meant abandoning everything they had worked for, and starting over with nothing. For elderly residents especially, this prospect was more terrifying than the isolation of staying. For others, the reason was emotional. They had buried family members in the local cemetery. They had married in the local church. Their children had been born in houses they had built with their own hands. To leave would be to abandon not just buildings but memories, to declare that a lifetime of experiences had become meaningless. A third group stayed from a sense of duty. Someone had to maintain the buildings. Someone had to prevent vandalism and theft. Someone had to ensure that when historians or tourists eventually arrived, there would be something left to see. These self-appointed caretakers saw themselves as guardians of history, preserving the past for a future they might never see. The final group, perhaps the smallest but most interesting, stayed, because they simply could not imagine living anywhere else. The ghost town had become their entire world. The rhythms of their days were defined by its geography. The silence that others found oppressive, they found peaceful. They had adapted so completely to isolation that the prospect of rejoining normal society seemed more alien than remaining among the ruins. Today, ghost towns face a strange dilemma. Left alone, they will eventually collapse into dust, erasing all physical evidence of the communities that once thrived there. They become museums, curated versions of the past that may bear little resemblance to the messy reality of life in a dying town. Bodie represents one approach to this paradox. The California State Park System maintains the town in a state of arrested decay, neither restored to its former glory nor allowed to deteriorate further. Buildings are stabilized but not rebuilt. Artifacts are protected but not polished. The goal is to preserve the town exactly as it was when the last residents departed, dust and all. This approach has its critics. Some argue that arrested decay simply postpones the inevitable, that Bodie will eventually crumble despite all efforts to prevent it. Others question whether the authentic state being preserved is truly authentic at all, since the town has been modified countless times over the decades for safety and accessibility. The alternative approach, exemplified by Calico, involves active reconstruction. Missing buildings are rebuilt based on historical photographs. Damaged structures are repaired to look new. The goal is to show visitors what the town looked like in its prime, not in its decline. This, too, has critics. A rebuilt ghost town, they argue, is no longer a ghost town at all. It is a theme park wearing the costume of history. The authenticity that makes ghost towns meaningful is precisely their decay, their silence, their sense of abandonment. To erase these qualities is to erase the very thing that makes them worth preserving. There is no perfect solution to this paradox. Every preserved ghost town represents a choice about what aspects of history matter most, and every choice inevitably excludes something that someone considers important. 175 years have passed since James Marshall discovered gold at Sutter's Mill, and set in motion the greatest treasure hunt in American history. The prospectors who rushed west are long dead. Their children are dead. Even their grandchildren have mostly passed from this world. What remains are the towns they built, and abandoned silent witnesses to dreams that flared bright and burned out. Walking through a ghost town today, you cannot help but feel the weight of absence. Every building once held life. Every street once echoed with voices. Every window once framed a face looking out at a world full of possibility. Now there is only silence and dust, and the slow patient work of time erasing what human hands created. Yet something survives. In the careful preservation of Bodie, in the reconstructed streets of Calico, in the haunting ruins of Rhyolite. We have chosen, as a society, to remember these places, to maintain them, visit them, and reflect on what they teach us about ambition and The last residents of the ghost towns understood something that we are only beginning to grasp. They knew that places hold memory. They knew that abandoning a town means abandoning not just buildings but stories, not just structures but souls. They stayed behind to keep those memories alive, to ensure that when the rest of the world finally turned its attention back to these forgotten places, there would be something left to see. They were guardians of silence, caretakers of ghosts, and in their stubborn refusal to leave, they gave us a gift that no amount of gold could purchase: the chance to remember. The ghost towns are not dead. They are waiting for visitors who will walk their empty streets and wonder about the people who once lived there, waiting for stories that will preserve their memory for another generation, waiting for someone to notice that even in abandonment, even in silence, even in decay, something human endures. If you felt something walking through these abandoned streets with Usif, you found yourself wondering about the families who lived and left, the caretakers who stayed behind, the children who played among the ruins. Then you understand why these stories matter. This channel is dedicated to uncovering the forgotten chapters of history, the stories that textbooks overlook, the places that time has almost erased, the ordinary people who lived extraordinary lives simply by refusing to give up. Subscribe to join us on the next journey. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a new exploration, and leave a comment telling us which ghost town you would most like to visit. Thank you for watching. Until next time.